Okay, I know absolutely no one's been waiting on this, but it is time now for my look at Kamen Rider Kiva. A rather interesting horror themed series. And oh boy, was this been a bit difficult for me to get through, if only because of my own personal taste in Kamen Rider. So I guess let's start off with the plot of Kiva, which I have to say is probably one of the more interesting aspects of the series, as a series should have an interesting plot. Anyway, the plot is split up into two different timelines. The only series to date to do this whole dual timeline thing, and probably what makes it probably stand out as something more unique. One is in the modern day as of 2008, when the series premiered, and the other one takes place 22 years in the past, in 1986 to be specific. In a modern world, or modern day, we follow Wataru Kurenai, a young man with an allergy to the world itself that's later shown to be all in his own head, who lives alone in an infamous haunted house. He doesn't really care for much in the world outside of, well, finding ingredients to make his violin sound better. And no, you did not hear me wrong, he finds ingredients to almost cook into his violin to make it sound better for when he plays it. Yes, it's a pretty weird character trait. Anyway, Wataru does have one secret outside of the whole violin thing. The secret is that he is half Fangire. The Fangire in this world being a vampire-like race who drain souls instead of blood as their main food source. Actually, Wataru himself doesn't figure out that he's half Fangire until halfway through the series, but it's kind of obvious that his powers come from the fact that he's half Fangire fairly early on, if you ask me, even without the future knowledge. Anyway, with the help of his partner, a small bat-like creature named Kiva III, he can transform into the titular Kamen Rider Kiva, and with the power of Kiva, fights Fangire to protect humanity, alongside various other forces who are hunting down the Fangire, such as the Arm Monsters and the Blue Sky Organization, or specifically the wonderful Blue Sky Organization. In the past, we follow Wataru's father, Otoya, as he slowly uncovers the world of the Fangire and the ones who hunt them in the shadows, the aforementioned Blue Sky Organization, while hitting on any hot woman that passes him by, as he's kind of a womanizer. At least he's portrayed as one. He's not really as much of one as you would think. Kiva is a pretty strange series for a Kamen Rider series. It has a lot of mystery surrounding Wataru's origins. I mean, that's not uncommon for Kamen Rider. Half the series start off with the main rider either having amnesia and are just being confused about where they come from, or there being some secret revelation about their specific past tied into the main plot. It's funny that I say this as I've watched episode 25 of Kamen Rider Revice. Okay, to be specific, with the timeline split, we're showing a lot of cause and effect. So we see, for example, in episode 1, Fangire who's being hunted down by the Blue Sky Organization, and Otoya helping someone from the organization avoid being killed by said Fangire, and then we see Wataru take out the same Fangire in the present day. This kind of split isn't too bad, but I've heard some people were a little confused about how the episode switches between the two time periods throughout various episodes, especially in the later half. I personally didn't have any issue with this, but I do feel they start blending into each other a lot easier the later the series goes on, and the deeper the drama and plot lines about Wataru's origins becomes more and more apparent. Overall, I kind of like the two timelines things. It does enhance the mystery in its own way, as well as the Fangire themselves. The Fangire are probably one of the more explored group of kaijin in the series, considering the fact that we go into their internal politics and all that stuff in the whole Fangire society. Or at least we get a surface level view of them and their higher ups, such as the king of the Fangire and the whole royal court in its own way. No, I still think that we go a bit further in with the let's say the Kaijin and Phais, only because we have main characters who are part of their group. But I honestly think that these are probably the second most explored Kaijin group that aren't just base monsters, as they are their own complex society of creatures who do have their own way of life and just have to consume humans in order to survive. Also, yes, the Fangire King does obviously become a much larger plot point as the series goes on. And, of course, this also ties into Wataru's origins. But as for the Fangires as a Kaijin group, outside of how we see them in the series, I'm not that into vampires, and these are just another take on vampires that just have more monstery forms, as well as have a pretty interesting stained glass motif to their designs. But outside of that, they're just vampires, and it's not the most interesting group of Kaijin out there. Like, they're just vampires. They just look weird. I mean, yeah, the Vampire King plotline is pretty compelling, but again, they're just vampires. One thing I feel that sets Kiva apart is that, at its heart, Kiva is ultimately a love story. Yeah, it is, basically. I haven't really talked about characters yet, and that's because, well, the main characters of Kiva aren't really the main characters of Kiva. It's Wataru, and then later on, his childhood friends, Mio and Taiga, who are also both tied into the Fangire King plotline, and the love triangle that exists between the three of them, as well as the fact that Mio is Taiga's fiancé. Honestly speaking, this love triangle is probably the most interesting plotline in Kiva for me, and I'm not that big a fan of love triangles. Like, yeah, it's basically just because all three members of the love triangle are probably the most well-written characters in the show, and everyone else is kind of just not as good as them. It's also helped the fact that in most love triangles, either one or two participants in that love triangle are planks of wood, and that's not the case here. Mio and Taiga are their own full characters, and honestly, Mio stands out as a pretty big part of why this love triangle works so well, especially because, her feelings for Wataru are pushing her towards some rather interesting ends, if you ask me. I don't want to say the quote, but people who do have seen the series, you know the quote I want to bring up. Now, here's where we'll talk about Suits, but honestly speaking, I want to change the way I talk about Suits and make a kind of YouTube shorts series. So look forward to that eventually, if I eventually manage to get that off the ground. And let's move on to music, because Kiva has some really great tracks. The opening Break the Chain is one of the best OPs in the entirety of the Heisei era, and especially Heisei Phase 1. And the theme of Kiva's final form, Emperor form, Supernova, is just pure hype. This song is great. I know I'm not the best music critic, because I can't really go into detail about why the song is great, outside of just listen to it and it's really good. But the series as a whole has a really strong focus on violin and then string instruments, which does make sense considering the fact that Wataru is a violinist. So it makes sense that the series that he's the main character of would have a violin motif that's pretty banger. Normally I go a bit longer on this stuff, but honestly speaking, I don't have a lot to say about Kiva. I hear Kiva's a divisive series, and I can understand why. It's a fine series and does what it needs to do pretty well, being a pretty good mystery, and the Fangires being serviceable, if just not out-and-out vampires. But I don't find myself liking it too much. Like, maybe the general premise doesn't hit with me that well, or maybe I just wish it would go a bit harder on the horror themes that are behind it. I didn't even mention the arm monsters, because they kind of fall off halfway through the series, despite at least the wolf one being super important to the plot, considering the fact that at some point he's a secondary rider of the series, or at least he's the one who prototypes the system. But I'll talk about that suit when I eventually get to it, because I honestly have a lot to say about that honestly really interesting suit. And yeah, I honestly say that this one's a bit better than Den-O in my own personal opinion, because Den-O kind of annoys me with his time travel, but both it and Den-O are series I'm just not that fond of. But hey, I guess Den-O does something right, because it's a series that gets the yearly crossover. Speaking of, Den-O just had a crossover with the newest Super Sentai season before his first episode even premiered. Seriously, every year a Den-O crossover. Oh God, what will be the crossover for 2023?